I'm Curtis Knight. I'm the host of the Fishwater People podcasts, and today we're talking about infrastructure, climate change, the redwoods, California condors, the Yurok Tribe, and so much more, all in one of the most beautiful places in California.
Yeah, and how weird that in a wet year with over 200% of normal snowpack and reservoirs filling, I've even got snow on Mount Tamalpais this morning here in Marin County. Governor Newsom has declared such a water emergency that he's got to cut minimum flows for fish in the Delta.
So we're going to go right there, right out of the gate. That's Congressman Jared Huffman. He represents California's 2nd Congressional District. He serves as the ranking member of the Natural Resources Subcommittee on Water, Wildlife, and Fisheries. Jared also founded the Congressional Free Thought Caucus, which he co-chairs to promote public policy based on reason, science, and moral values. And we should just mention your district, too.
Sure.
Golden Gate to Oregon. You've said this. It's the most beautiful district in the country, and I bet you put your dukes up and fought it out with some people who argue that, but I bet you win often, because it is.
How could I not? My goodness, it's such a gorgeous district. And for people that care about water and fish, it's an important place as well.
Well, this has been a hot topic, I know, in the Capitol and throughout California. Okay, just to fill in our listeners, the executive order that Governor Newsom issued, we're talking about, was put into action in February of 2023. And it's a waiver that authorizes the State Water Resources Control Board to consider modifying state requirements that dictate how much water in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta is allowed to flow into the San Francisco Bay, which means more water can be stored and less water will be left in the streams for fish. One of the concerns is it overrides the rules that are there to help enforce the federal and state Endangered Species Acts. So that's why it's such a concerning thing from an environmental perspective. Talk about just the process of an executive order. In our minds, it sort of usurps the water board's authority.
There was no process as far as I could tell. Governor Newsom just decided he wanted more pumping in the Delta, so he suspended a couple of state environmental laws using emergency authorities and leaned on the water board to do a temporary change petition for more pumping and more storage. And of course they said yes, as everybody knows they will in these situations. I actually think a cold political decision was made. There was just more value in sending water to the exporters right now. And there's maybe a number of things in that calculation. You've got the Colorado River imploding, all kinds of angst in Southern California about what that could mean. But, when it comes to these powerful San Joaquin Valley irrigators, there's just never enough water for them to get their hands on. So in dry years, we hear about it, and because, they're fallowing fields and they're raising hell, and so we usually take it on the chin in dry years. This is one of the first times I can remember where we had to take it on the chin in a wet year. And that, to me, is what's so troubling here. It basically means fish are just always going to be thrown under the bus. Yeah, I think the most disappointing thing about it for me, these waivers of so-called minimum flows for fish, you don't really have minimum flows for fish. Fish are just always going to get screwed. And that's what this says in dry years and in wet years. I've talked to Governor Newsom about these complex water issues. He's smart. He understands that this water flowing through the Delta is not wasted. He understands that it is needed for minimum water quality and for outmigrating fish, and in this case for winter run salmon that are just hanging on by a thread.
Right.
And yet he bought into this rhetoric that water in wet weather events that flows out of the Delta is wasted. That's really troubling.
Yeah, right. A lot of us understand just how silly that idea is. Our rivers have evolved to take a certain amount of flow. High flows are when a lot of work is done. Sediments move, nutrients are moved, rearing habitat is available. So those resilient fish in these wet years have an opportunity to weather through dry years and tougher times that will happen. What's your role in something like this as a congressman?
I can do a few things. First of all, I can let the state and the governor know what I think about this, and I'm doing that. The state agencies don't really have to meet with me, but, some of them will. Federal agencies do sort of have to meet with me. Mm-hmm. And, we're going to let them know what we think about this. One of the messages here is that the State Water Board makes these water quality decisions under a grant of authority from the federal government. Not everybody understands that. The primary authority comes from the U.S. EPA on clean drinking water and things like that. And there comes a point where if you've delegated to a state agency that won't do its job, you got to ask the question whether that authority should continue to be delegated. So these are conversations that I'll be having with the U.S. EPA.
Yeah, that's interesting. So the federal nexus there with the water board, a little stronger than people might think as a state agency.
Yeah, I certainly continue to be really engaged on the federal side of water. In California, that takes me into fisheries management, particularly like commercial fisheries, marine fisheries. But as you know, there's overlapping resource management on fisheries under the Endangered Species Act and all these different authorities that we talk about. The state, though, really has the primary responsibility when it comes to water rights and when it comes to a lot of these decisions. So, in some ways, my ability to really lean in and shape outcomes is a little bit more limited in the Delta, but, I can do it on things like the federal Central Valley Project to the extent that they will listen to me. Now that I'm in the minority, it's a little harder. I don't want to just sit on the sidelines while something that I consider really outrageous is happening.
You were, I think, chairing a couple of the committees back in Washington, D.C. Now, I think it translates to you being the ranking member.
Which is a huge difference. I could call an emergency hearing on something like this. I could bring in witnesses. Mm-hmm. We could, really spotlight what's going on in the right way. As ranking member, I wait for my Republican counterpart to decide what the agenda is going to be and what kind of hearings we're going to have, what bills will get voted on.
Okay, just a few weeks after we spoke with Congressman Huffman, Governor Newsom issued another executive order that walked back removal of protections due to the amount of precipitation California continued to receive. So there was so much water and enough pushback from environmental groups, tribal, and others that it made sense to change that original executive order so quickly. So it's a relief that more water is being left in our streams now, but the precedent is still really concerning. Our environmental protections can be taken away so quickly. And as Congressman Huffman pointed out, this is one of the first times we saw this happen in a wet year. I want to pivot a little bit just to climate change. I'm really curious to hear how you think about it, especially having that federal, national perspective, but also maybe just like top of mind, how it's affecting your district.
Climate change obviously affects my district with things like the catastrophic wildfires that we've seen.
Yeah.
So that's a very visible and obvious way. But it affects us in other ways too. I mean, we have had a heck of a time sort of year after year with these ocean events that kind of blindside us with changing conditions out there, toxic algal blooms that affect the Dungeness crab fishery. We had a complete die-off of our kelp forests on a lot of the North Coast because of a starfish wasting disease that kind of created this ripple effect through the ecosystem.
Wow.
I think there are absolutely climate-related reasons for that. So we see it in the water shortages and the drought problems that we're continuing to have. And I think these grim conversations we're having about the Delta and about fish getting short of their minimum flows are really just another indication of the sort of scarcity and volatile conditions that we've known for a long time. Climate change was going to bring this to us. It's here.
And all those changes that we're seeing, they translate in a lot of ways, but mostly through water. That seems like one of the bigger influences that climate change is going to have on California is how our water comes to us, how it's available, how it's not available.
Which is a big deal. And people need to sort of pause and understand why that is such a big deal. Our entire way of life, our cities, our development patterns, the states in the Western United States all sprang up because we thought we could rely on these sort of predictable weather patterns in the West.
Right. And so let's talk about a little bit of like, what are we going to do? I mean, I think the Inflation Reduction Act, I think, was one of the biggest investments in climate action that we've seen by the federal government, right?
So yeah, Inflation Reduction Act was the biggest thing we've ever done on that. But before that, we did a bill, it's referred to commonly as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law.
Right.
The name is the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act.
Right.
Huge amounts of money in there for some of these resiliency challenges, including the largest investment in Western water infrastructure we've ever done. I helped to write that section. So, we are trying to step up and invest in the kind of tools that'll help us through this.
The Bipartisan Infrastructure Act secures $50 billion for water storage and $21 billion for environmental projects. And the Inflation Reduction Act, a separate bill, provides an additional $4 billion to specifically address the ongoing drought in the West. That investment in infrastructure, I think, is so important. You look around at every big dam that we have in California, and most of them were built in a 30 to maybe 40-year period from the 30s to the 60s. That's about it. That's when it all got done. It's time to revisit a lot of that. We have our eyes set on removing some dams, but it's not just dam removal. It's also this investment in using our water more efficiently. Equity is a big part of that too.
Well, that's right. And, take a look at the Delta. I mean, we could talk all day long about the Delta, but, you've got 30 million people plus that get at least some of their water from this system that is so fragile, that is going to be impacted by rising sea levels, that has infrastructure kind of from that same era, really, that you just described, a little of it more recently. But we got to reimagine that whole facility. And there are some people that want to reimagine it by just saying, we'll just suck even more water and we don't care about the fish and the downstream water quality and the others who will be impacted by it. We got to do better than that. We actually need to find alternative water strategies that don't rely on more pumping from that estuary.
The San Joaquin Valley irrigation system and the Delta could honestly be its own episode. We'll keep the conversation moving for today. It's definitely worth a deep dive.
And that's going to be the case with a lot of water systems, I think, around the West. We have to realize that they're vulnerable, they're fragile, maybe not even reliable. And we got to invest in the kind of things that will de-escalate these conflicts instead of just saying fish have to be losers.
Colorado River probably underscores that for the nation and certainly in the West. That whole idea of dead pool, that you would essentially have nothing coming out of Lake Powell or Mead. I mean, that's extraordinary. And what does that mean? How do things fall apart? And I think it's underappreciated too for a lot of Californians, especially Northern Californians, about how important that water is to Southern California.
The connections are underappreciated. You're absolutely right. When Southern California loses its Colorado River water, as it's going to lose at least some of it, it's losing it now already. They don't have too many other places to turn.
The Colorado River, of course, is a huge drainage that feeds water to 40 million people. About a third of Southern California's water comes from the Colorado River. And right now, the situation, I think a lot of people have heard about this with Lake Mead and Lake Powell, this idea of dead pool. And when the water stops flowing out of the dam, you can imagine what that looks like. The river starts to literally run dry, and it's really getting close to that. Talking about the Colorado River and the angst there, it's real, and it's something for all of us here in California to pay attention to. Maybe you know about CalTrout, or maybe we're brand new to you, but we've been around for over 50 years, working hard every day to restore California's freshwater ecosystems and to keep them healthy for years to come. To find out more about the work California Trout is doing across the state, or to become a member, visit caltrout.org. That's CalTrout.org. Talk about your district. One of our most heavily invested areas is our Arcata office, our North Coast office.
And I'm so glad that CalTrout has been active in my district, because those rivers are really wonderful. They're pristine. They still need some help because we've done some things to their estuaries and their watersheds that are going to need some care and feeding. But the potential for restoration in some of these places is great.
I was just over there last week and got to tour some of the same projects that you did. And one thing that really struck me about this is sea level rise is pushing the agenda there. Dairy farmers are losing fields to saltwater intrusion. So you're seeing pasture land getting turned right before their eyes into saltgrass marsh, which has opened up these opportunities where they're now motivated to do this restoration.
Yeah, we have to be nimble and seize opportunities, I think. The economics of dairy farming is not great. That's got to be a factor as well.
Mm-hmm.
But, another example of just opportunities that we maybe didn't even see a few years ago is just how uneconomical some hydropower is these days. It used to be we thought hydropower was like the best power out there and the cheapest and greatest. And the folks that own these hydropower projects in many cases are trying to unload them right now because they can buy power cheaper through wind and solar, and maintaining some of these facilities is becoming a real burden for PG&E and others.
I can think of one example of that that I know you've been heavily involved with, as we have, and a whole bunch of others. This is a big issue in your district. The Potter Valley project, owned by PG&E, 2 dams on the main stem Eel River. The lower one diverts water over to the Russian and has been doing that for 100 years. Is pretty complex. There's everything involved with interbasin transfers of water, a utility that's under duress, a lot of reliance on that water in both watersheds. They're all within your district. They're all your people. And I know you've played a real leadership role on trying to find what we've really embraced and called this 2-basin solution. Can you just talk a little bit about where that's at right now?
Yeah, absolutely. So you described it pretty well. This Potter Valley project, which is a PG&E hydropower project, no longer pencils out for PG&E. I think they lose something like $9 million a year running this thing.
7 to 9, yep.
7 to 9. So, no surprise. This company that is trying to claw its way out of bankruptcy has decided that rather than go through a protracted federal relicensing battle that'll cost a ton, that'll probably impose a bunch of new costs. And so they, the prize for getting through relicensing is they get to lose more than $7-9 million a year on this facility.
Right.
I think it's no shocker that they made a business decision to just let it go. And the way that works is they have to first offer it up to anybody else who might want to take it on. Nobody else was dumb enough to want to lose $9 million a year on this facility and have to clear all the hurdles of FERC relicensing. So we're now in a really interesting place, decommissioning and abandonment of the facility. And there's a special federal regulatory process that decommissions these facilities. So it's kind of crunch time, because in less than a year, PG&E will have to present its draft abandonment and decommissioning plan to FERC, the federal regulator. All of the stakeholders with their different interests will be weighing in on that, but it involves really big decisions. They got to decide what to do with it, and the biggest decisions involve their water rights, which right now are water rights for making hydropower. And there's certainly some value in those water rights, but probably only if the state board allows them to be modified for other uses. And so that's complicated, and that's kind of its own bucket of issues. But the other is the infrastructure and the facilities, the 2 dams that you mentioned. The hydropower making facilities are all going to go. We know that. But there's a big question about whether someone might want to try to keep those dams, or whether we have an opportunity to remove them and open up fish passage and restoration for the Eel River, which could use some help. Our challenge is going to be in the Russian River Basin, educating a lot of folks about what these dams do and do not do. I think there's this belief out there that somehow these dams are water supply dams. And they're really, certainly Scott Dam is not at all a water supply dam. It was built to basically provide a more regulated flow so that PG&E could make power 12 months of the year. It was about maximizing hydropower revenues. It's never been a water supply dam. And so if you look at and this is something I tell people every chance I get, if you look at the 15 years where this project operated before Scott Dam was finished, all they had was that second dam. It's a low head kind of regulating dam for the diversion. And they push more water into the Russian River Basin than they have in recent years without Scott Dam for power. They just did it mostly during wet months, right? So that should be our guidepost here. That tells us that something like a run-of-the-river solution can absolutely work. We can take water when it's available in wet periods, move it over into Lake Mendocino and the Russian River Basin to meet the needs that have built up over the last 100 years. But it would take at least one, maybe two of those dams out, which would be a really big deal for the Eel River and its salmon and steelhead populations. I'm kind of excited about it because, in the past, all the folks in Humboldt County and on the Eel River just wanted to cut off that diversion and take the water back. They wanted to go back kind of to conditions before the project. There's been a real evolution now, and even hardline environmental groups like Friends of the Eel River are saying we can share that water with the Russian River interests. We just want those dams out, and we can have both if we're smart and if we come together. So really appreciate CalTrout's leadership on this issue.
And let's just try to define that a little bit. And the idea of a two-basin solution is to find a way to make that system work for both the fish, especially on the eel side, and the people, especially on the Russian side. But it's also not forget a lot of the people on the eel side, most significantly a lot of the tribal communities that are there that depend on a healthy eel river, that depend on the fish. So there's fish and people issues on both sides. And how do you find this balance? How do you bring this balance? And one of the solutions that have been talked about is removing these two big dams, allowing fish to access hundreds of miles of habitat high up in the Eel River Basin and still provide a way to divert water to the Russian side, primarily in the winter, to be stored in Lake Mendocino and used for later in the summer. How do you make something like that work? How do you get the engineering to work on something like that? How do you get the funding to do something like that? And one of the biggest challenges is how do you get the communities, the interests, the politics in both those basins to come and start to really zero in on that kind of solution. Now we're going to pull in one of our CalTrout team members, Darren Mierau, our North Coast Director. He is in the heart of Congressman Huffman's district and an area with so much going on in the water world.
All right, I figured it out.
Nothing like a hotspot in a car to really prime the audio for a podcast, Darren.
Exactly.
Well played. Where are we at with the two-basin solution? Is it still viable?
We have, I think, a pretty clear vision for what we want to achieve. I think, our team and our coalition of conservation groups are still open to the concept of a two-basin solution, but I think it's incumbent on the Russian River interests to really make that happen. They need to come to us with those solutions in order to bring us into what they want to achieve. But otherwise, we have our own clear path forward, and that's taking out Scott Dam, it's taking out Cape Horn Dam, and potentially being open to putting in some kind of new diversion structure that doesn't cause fish migration issues. But otherwise, yeah.
The default path right now with PG&E in this surrender process is for the facilities to get shut down. Possibly FERC will require PG&E to remove all the facilities there completely, and you have a free running eel and no diversion.
And it's going to be a seminal moment when PG&E comes forward with their plan and we get to see what their thinking is, because they've been not very forthcoming in terms of what their perspective is on this. But that's going to be really interesting to see where they come out in public with that.
Thanks for sharing CalTrout's perspective, Darren.
Sure thing.
So we're all paying close attention to the Potter Valley project, and since we talked with Darren, PG&E has stated that they're not replacing the transformers, which means they won't be producing electricity from the project anymore. And Scott Dam has been found to be less seismically sound than previously thought. And this is something that Friends of the Eel and a lot of others have been pointing out, that the seismic activity around that dam is a really dangerous situation, and that's proving to be true. So the updates just keep coming, and the situation keeps changing, but the big picture from our perspective is that the status quo is clearly not working. I want to talk a little bit about just the North Coast and some of the tribal communities there. They're always been close partners with us, a lot of these tribal communities, and we just see so much opportunity to continue to build on that. And the North Coast in particular, but it's amazing the opportunity there because there's still that presence.
I'm so proud to represent Indian country. I have more Native American tribes in my district than anyone else in the continent, in the contiguous United States. Alaska has more, but I've got the most down here. So it's really been amazing to watch our evolution on this. Tribal consultation and co-management and engagement used to be an afterthought certainly for most government agencies and certainly for NGOs as well. And it seems like increasingly today it's becoming something that we seek out at the front end of these things we do.
Right.
And the tribes themselves are building capacity. I mean, the Yurok Tribe's fishery program is impressive.
Yeah.
They got incredible people. They have great capacity. So they're valued partners.
One project where that partnership really stands out for me is Redwood Creek, one of CalTrout's project sites about 40 minutes north of Arcata. It's just a fantastic site.
Beautiful watershed and great potential fishing there too. One of these days, we're going to be wading in that creek and catching steelhead. I can see it.
Yeah, absolutely. It lives up to its name, what you think of Redwood Creek. It's definitely got all that beauty, pristine headwaters coming out of a national park, comes down into the town of Orick. There's an old mill site there that we've been partnering with Save the Redwoods League, and then the Yurok Tribal Corporation, which was formed to actually be able to get out there and move the dirt and do the restoration themselves, creating jobs. And it's been a really satisfying project for us to be out there with them and hear them say, hey, this is great, creating jobs for our community and restoring, what are our ancestral lands.
Yeah, it's such a beautiful part of the world. And for some of your, CalTrout supporters and anglers who, get in planes and go to Idaho and Montana and things like that, they need to just get in their Tesla and drive north on the 101. And you're going to see these amazing rivers. And there's so much going on there. This Redwood Creek estuary, which used to be a coastal lagoon, has the potential to really come back to life in some wonderful ways through this project that you're working on with the Yurok Tribe and the Army Corps of Engineers. But the mill site, everything else upstream, there's so much activity. And what's interesting is not far from there, the Yurok Tribe is also partnering with federal agencies on reintroduction of the California condor.
Right.
Which has been a huge success so far. I got to go to the condor rearing facility, and when you see them up close, you realize these are not like turkey vultures. These things are 747s. They're just enormous, goofy birds. And their unique niche in the ecosystem, lots of these birds eat dead things. The condor is the only one with a big enough, powerful enough beak to get through a marine mammal. So they go down to the beaches and they hack into the washed up seals and whales in ways that other birds can't. So it's a pretty interesting story.
Yeah, I can't wait to be out on the river and see a condor flying above me. How amazing is that going to be? And it's such a good reminder that when we're talking about healthy watersheds and rivers, it isn't just about fish. It's about entire ecosystems being healthy. Well, Congressman Jared, always good to just spend some time with you chatting. Next time, let's do it over a campfire after a day of fishing or something like that on one of your beautiful North Coast rivers that you represent.
Love it. Thanks for what you do, Curtis. Appreciate the conversation.
So that's a wrap on our first ever episode. It's a big deal for us at CalTrout to be stepping into the podcasting world. but let's not forget to keep it fishy and get some wit and wisdom from an angler, and not just any angler. Let's go deep with our very own Craig Ballinger.
One of the most common questions asked of an angler is, what's the biggest trout you've ever caught? The fact is, everyone agrees that the largest one they ever caught is the one that got away. The big fish that got away haunts an angler forever and remains indelibly printed upon their minds. Then, of course, the question arises amongst anglers is, why do we remember fish that got away and all the big fish we've caught over the years dissolve into nothing? My theory, and many others, is that it's sort of a DNA sort of thing. Probably survival from back when sapiens were totally hunter-gatherers, and you had to build information. Fish that get away certainly teach me more than fish I've landed.
Thanks so much to Congressman Huffman, Regional Director Darren Mierau, and CalTrout Ambassador Craig Ballinger. And of course, all of you who support CalTrout. And shout out to the band Wilco for our theme music. A while back, I made a wish list of bands and songs that would be awesome to have on the podcast, and Wilco was at the top. They're one of my favorite bands, so our producers reached out and they graciously gave us permission to use one of their songs with the message, "Good work with the trout." So thanks for your support, Wilco, and thanks so much for the music. I'm Curtis Knight, Executive Director of CalTrout and your host of the Fishwater People podcast. This episode was produced, edited, and engineered by Bridget Shaw and Drew Alvarez with help from Kara Glenwright and Tracy Diaz. Thanks for listening, and be sure to subscribe.